In the last video we learned how to include external JavaScript packages like htmx in our Webpack builds, and we also learned how to include CSS style sheets into the bundle. In this video we're going to go one step further. We're going to learn how to work with TypeScript and Django, and we're going to learn how to work with files and Webpack. This video is going to reference this blog post that's on the screen at the moment. Check that out if you want any additional information. There's also an additional section on using Babel with Webpack that we're not going to cover in this video, just to keep it a little bit shorter. So let's get started. We're continuing with the code that we had from the previous project. This is the Webpack configuration file here. And so far what we've got is an entry point that points to the JavaScript file that is the entry for our application. We have an output section that determines where the bundle is going to be output to and what that bundle is going to be called. And we also have these module rules. This defines the loaders that we're using in our Webpack configuration. In this case we have some rules for CSS loaders. Any file that ends in .css, we will apply the CSS loader and the style loader, and what that's going to do is basically add the CSS styles to our output bundle so that they are available and your clients can fetch both the JavaScript and the CSS with one request in that case. So let's now dive in, and we're going to learn how to use TypeScript with Django and Webpack. Now if you're not familiar with TypeScript, let's go to the page here, the documentation. It's basically JavaScript, but it adds those type hints. In other words, it's a strongly typed programming language. It builds on JavaScript, and it makes it more similar in some ways to things like Java, where you have strong typing. And some developers really like having these strongly typed languages. It can provide some benefits for your editors and for testing, and it can help you find errors in development. Let's now see how to add this using Webpack. So I'm going to go back to the blog post. As you can see here, there's a section on TypeScript and Django. Now to use TypeScript, you have to install it using npm. What we're going to do is use the npm install command, and we're going to install both TypeScript and the TS loader. The TS loader is what we're going to use with Webpack to transform TypeScript files into raw JavaScript. So the TS loader is similar in some ways to the CSS loader and the style loader. It's transforming a file of a particular type to a different output. So let's copy this npm install command, and what I'm going to do is bring up a terminal here, and I'm going to paste that command in, and we can run that npm install command, and we specify the -D flag, and that will add these libraries as development dependencies. When that's done, you can inspect your package.json file, and under the dev dependencies block, you can see we now have both the TS loader and TypeScript. What we now need to do is add a TypeScript configuration file to this project. We already have a Webpack config file. We're now going to add another file here, and that's going to be called tsconfig.json. This is a JSON file, and we're going to go back to the blog post here, and as you can see we have here this tsconfig block. We're going to copy that and paste it into this new file that we've created. So let's paste that in here and save the file. Now this JSON file tells us the settings for outputting and compiling TypeScript to JavaScript, and this is based on a very similar configuration that's defined in the TypeScript section of Webpack's documentation. So there's a TypeScript page that you can reference. I'll link that below the video. If we scroll down, we have a sample TypeScript configuration file here. And if you want to know more about the settings that you can use with TypeScript, there's a documentation link below this block. You can click that and you'll find that there's actually a lot of different configuration options for TypeScript. What we've done, if we go back to VS Code, we have an out directory, and when we compile the TypeScript down to vanilla JavaScript, this setting tells TypeScript where to output the files that are generated from that compilation. So now that we've defined the configuration file for TypeScript, we're going to actually add a TypeScript file to our project. So let's go to the project, and we're going to go to the scripts directory, and we're going to define a new file here, and we're going to call it calculator.ts. Now .ts is the TypeScript extension, and in here we're going to define two functions. One's going to be called add, and that's simply going to add two numbers. So these are trivial functions, but we just want to demonstrate what TypeScript looks like. So this function takes two arguments, number 1 and number 2. Now what we're going to do is, instead of writing the parameters like this, we can actually give them types, and that is what TypeScript is essentially used for. So for number 1, we can give it the type of number by using the colon and then specifying the data type after that. And we can do the same for number 2 as well. And in TypeScript, we can also write the return type using the colon and then define the type of the return statement for that function. In this case, the add function will take two numbers, it will add them up, and it will return another number. So that's the signature of this function. Let's now define the body of the function, and of course it's going to be a very trivial body. It's going to be number 1 plus number 2. Let's now write a second function called sum. So that's going to take a parameter called numbers, which is going to be of the type number array. So it's an array of numbers, and to specify that we use this syntax here. We have the data type followed by the square brackets. That's an array of numerical values, and again this is going to return a number. Now we can write the body again, and what we'll do this time is we can use the reduce function. JavaScript arrays have this reduce function that you can use to reduce the array to a single number. In this case we'll use numbers.reduce, and the parameter to this is a function, and it takes two arguments, a and b, and that's the numbers that it is encountering along the array. And for each of those numbers it's going to add them up, so it'll be a plus b, and it will do that for all the values in the array, and eventually we'll get the sum of the elements in that array. So in a very basic way, that's how TypeScript looks. We have these strongly typed parameters and return types. What we'll now do is test that this works by adding an event listener. So it's going to be window.add event listener, and we'll listen for the load event on the window. Basically when the page first loads in the browser, that event is going to fire and a callback function will run. And this is the callback function. It's the second parameter to the add event listener function. And let's just console log some values. We're going to call both the add function and the sum function with some values, and we'll see if those print to the browser console. If they do, we know this has worked and TypeScript is working in our application. Now one of the benefits of TypeScript is during development it gives you hints when something is not correct. So for example, if I change this number from the number 2 to a string with the number 2, it's now going to complain because it knows that this function add is expecting a numerical value, but we're passing a string to that value, which can cause some errors and bugs in your application. TypeScript can pick this up because we're using the typing, and it will tell you here that the argument of type string is not assignable to the parameter, which is of type number. So let's change that back to a number. And now we're going to try using this TypeScript file with Webpack. So what we'll do is go to our Webpack entry point, the index.js file within the scripts folder. I'm going to try and import that calculator.ts file. So we've imported that at the top. What we'll now do is we'll try and run our Webpack build process. If we go to the package.json file, we defined this dev script, and that runs Webpack in watch mode. So what we'll do is go back to our terminal and we can run that script, npm run script dev. But as you can see, we are now getting some errors in this build process, and the error is related to the calculator.ts file, and it gives you a bit more information below that. It says you may need an appropriate loader to handle this file type. So we're trying to add a TypeScript file into our bundle, but we need to compile that to JavaScript. We need to use a loader so that that work is done during the Webpack build process. So what we'll do now is go back to the Webpack config file, and within this rules array we're going to define a new JavaScript object. And here we're going to use the TS loader that we installed along with TypeScript and the npm command at the start of the video. So let's go back to the Webpack documentation, and if we go down to the configuration section here, and let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see that better, we have a rules section here which has a test for TypeScript files, and for any TypeScript files it finds it applies the TS loader to that. Let's copy these top two lines here and we're going to paste them into our Webpack configuration. So we're testing for TypeScript files, and for any we find, we're going to use the TS loader to transform those TypeScript files to raw JavaScript. And if we go back to the Webpack documentation, there's also a resolve section with some extensions here, and Webpack will try and resolve extensions in the order defined in this array. What I'm going to do is go to the blog post that I've got here, and I'm going to copy the resolve block from this post, and we'll paste that as a top level key into the Webpack configuration file. So we're resolving the TS extension first, and then any other extensions can be resolved after that in the order they're defined. And we can use the spread operator here to denote any other extension. So let's recap what we've done in the Webpack configuration file. We've added a resolve.extensions option, and that specifies that we resolve the TypeScript extensions first and then any other extensions after that. And most importantly, what we've done in the module.rules array, we've added a new object here for TypeScript files. Any TypeScript files will apply the TS loader, which should transform them from TypeScript to raw JavaScript. So let's now test that out. We can go back to our terminal, and I'm going to stop the build process for Webpack. We'll clear the terminal and we'll rerun the development script. Hopefully now we'll see no errors, and indeed that has compiled successfully. So let's now go to our browser. we've console logged the result of calling these functions. We're now going to see if these are actually printed to the console. So let's start Django's development server, and we can load the page up that we have from the previous video. If we load up the developer tools here, you can see the result of calling the add function and the sum function. So the TypeScript has been compiled down to raw JavaScript by the TypeScript loader that's added to our Webpack config, and we're now getting the output of those functions. And if we go to the bundle that's been generated by Webpack, and that's in the core static directory, it's called bundle.js, we can search for that function called add that we defined, and you can see it's down here on line 202. It has taken the parameters, for example, to that function, and it's got rid of the type hints that TypeScript had, which can help you in development, but in an actual JavaScript application it doesn't understand those types. So it's compiled that TypeScript down to vanilla JavaScript, and then we can use that in our bundle, and the code can be used on our application, and that's why we're seeing the console logs working. What we'll do now is add something a little bit more interesting and allow users to add numbers on the front end here. So let's go back to the blog post, and we'll scroll down here, and we're going to add this code to the body of our index.html template. So I'm just going to copy that from the blog post, and we're going to go to index.html, and we can add that at the bottom of the body tag. We'll just paste that in here. So we've got two divs that contain input elements. One has an ID of number 1, the second has an ID of number 2. We have a button, and when that button is clicked, it should calculate the sum of the two numbers above and output that sum into this paragraph tag below that has the ID of result. So let's now go back to our TypeScript calculator file, and we'll write code to add the two numbers from the input elements and output them to that paragraph. So let's get rid of the console logs now that we know TypeScript is working. We're going to get a reference to the button that we're going to click, and we can do that with the document.getElementById function. We can then define a click listener on this button, and we'll do that by using the add event listener function, and we're listening for a click event on the button, and this is the callback function that will be fired when that click event occurs. So when the button is clicked, we want to get a reference to both the input with number 1 and the input with number 2. These have IDs of num1 and num2. So let's go back to our TypeScript file, and we can get those inputs using document.getElementById. The ID is num1 for the first one, and we will cast that to an HTML input element. And this is again something we can do with TypeScript. We're telling the editor essentially that the number 1 variable here is of type HTML input element. And we can do the exact same with number 2. Once we have the elements for these numbers, what we can do is we can get the value that's in that input field, and we can parse that to an integer data type. So now we have the two numbers. Let's get a reference now to the result. That's the paragraph tag where we want to put the added result into. So to that HTML element that we've got here on line 17, we want to make the text content of that element equal to the addition of these two numbers that we've got here above. So we're adding value 1 and value 2 using this function that we defined earlier, and we're putting the result into the text content of that paragraph tag so that it should show up on our front end when we hit the button. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's go back to our page, and we're going to refresh this page now. We now have this very ugly looking section here of input elements and a button, but if we type 5 and 5 into these input elements, when we hit calculate sum, you can see that it outputs the sum of those numbers, and it's using TypeScript to do this. It's using the TypeScript file that we have. It's compiling that down to raw JavaScript in our bundle using the TS loader, and it's outputting the result to the DOM here using the code that we have in the click listener in the TypeScript file. And if I change that number to 55, it's now going to output the correct addition in this DOM element. So that's just a quick overview on how we can use TypeScript with Django and Webpack. It's very easy to do this. We just include the TS loader in our configuration, and then any TypeScript files that are used in our application can be compiled down to raw JavaScript and included in the bundle. So let's go back to the blog post. There's a section here on transpiling JavaScript with Babel. I'm not going to do this in the video. You can read this section on the blog if you want. Basically, Babel is used to take cutting edge JavaScript, the newest features in the language, and compile that down to a version that's understood by all or most browsers. An example of that would be to take the arrow function that is introduced to JavaScript fairly recently. Babel can take that and compile it down to a standard JavaScript function that uses the function keyword. And Babel does this by including plugins for certain tasks, and also presets which combine a group of plugins into a single unit. And you'll find presets for common things such as using React and JSX. If you're interested in more, read through this blog post here. What we'll do now though is we're going to skip to this section on asset modules, which are what you can use with Webpack when you're working with files in your application. Now before Webpack 5, which is what we're using in this series, when you were working with files you had to include loaders to perform certain tasks. In Webpack 5, this is now built in to Webpack and it uses something called asset modules. Let's go to the documentation on asset modules. This is a type of module that allows one to use asset files such as fonts and icons and images without configuring additional loaders. And Webpack 5 has added these 4 new module types, which you can read about here, and I'll link this page below the video. The one we're going to use in this video is the asset/resource module. What this does is it emits a separate file and it exports the URL. We're going to see what this means now. Let's go back to the blog post. The gist of what we're going to do is we're going to use asset modules here to bring images from an assets folder into our application. So we have this assets folder here. It contains scripts and styles at the moment. We're now going to get some images into this application. Now on the blog post, I've got a link here to some image you can use, or a site that contains stock images. Let's just grab one of these and we'll grab this one here. And we're now going to create in the assets folder an images directory. So let's create that just now. And I'm going to paste that image into that directory. So if we expand the images directory, we now have a reference to this image. Now during our Webpack build process, what we want to do is we want to output this image or any images that we're using in our application. We want to output these to our build directory. And this is so that when we deploy to our server, we're deploying the build directory. And we want all of these assets available in the build directory, such as images, so that they can actually be used on our server and served to our users. So remember that all of these files that we're using, the JavaScript files, the TypeScript files, and the CSS files, we are compiling them into a bundle, and it's that bundle that's deployed to our server. We want to make sure that the images that are in this assets folder are also deployed to our server, so we need to move them to our build directory. This is something we can use asset modules for. Let's see how to do that now. Let's go to the Webpack configuration file again. And under the module.rules, we're going to add a new block here, and we're going to define a test for image files in our application. So I'm going to paste a regular expression here that finds any image file, in other words, PNG, SVG, and so on. And for these files, we'll specify a type of asset/resource. This is the asset module that we're going to use to move these files to our build directory. And the asset resource should be a string, so make sure you do that. Now to test this, we need to import the image into our index.js entry point. So let's go to the entry point, and at the top here, we can actually import an image. We're importing the test image, and it's from the images directory within the assets folder. So we go back a directory here from the script folder that we're in to the parent assets folder, and then within the assets folder, it's the images folder, and that's the name of the file that we've downloaded. So let's save that, and now we're going to test running this using Webpack. If we go back to our terminal, we can now run the npm script that runs Webpack in watch mode, and you can see that it's compiled successfully. Let's go to our output directory, which is this core static directory. You can see we have, as well as the bundle.js, we have a new output, and that is a JPEG file. So Webpack here has dropped this image into our output directory that's going to be deployed to the server, and it's given it this new name here as well. Now with this new name here, we don't need to know that. We've imported this particular image and given it an alias called test image, and again you can call that anything you want, but the asset resource that we've used knows the URL to this image, so we can reference this test image here in our index.js or any other file that's used in our application. And basically we can reference this image URL that's generated here through this object here called test image. So let's add another block of code at the bottom here of our index.js file. It's another event listener. We're listening for the load event on the page. When that happens, we use JavaScript to create a new image object, and here's the important line here, it's line 20. We set the source of that image equal to the alias that we used when we imported the image at the top here. We called it test image, and that's what we set the source of this image to. Finally, we give the image some width and height, and then we append it to our document's body. So if we save that, we're still running Webpack in watch mode on this terminal, so that will then recompile. It will detect the changes and recompile. So let's go back to our page and refresh this page, and we now get the image successfully being loaded onto our page. If we inspect the source of that image in the developer tools, you can see that the URL, or the source for that image, uses the hash that was generated when the asset module moved it to the build directory, but we don't need to know about that hash because we can simply reference this test image that contains the URL embedded within that. So that's what asset modules can do when you're working with files such as images and fonts. These can be moved to your build directories and deployed to your servers. So any assets that you require in your JavaScript applications, you can manage them in this way. So that's all for this video. We've covered TypeScript and its use with Django and Webpack. We did a very quick dive into basic TypeScript features, and we've also seen how to use asset modules in order to move files from your asset directories into your build directory and deploy these to your server. Now I'm going to do one more video on Webpack, and that's going to dive into some advanced features such as the HTML Webpack plugin. We're going to look at how to generate multiple bundles, one for your source code for example, and one for vendor libraries such as html that don't change often. And we're going to look at how we can use caching with Webpack. After the next video, I want to do a quick dive into how you can set up Webpack with different stacks, for example 𝗏𝗵𝗽, Tailwind and Alpine, how you can set it up with React.js and Vue.js, and also how you can set it up with Svelte. So if you've enjoyed this video and learned anything, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.